Yeah, that's beautiful meditation. Thank you. Um, Interesting stuff. You know, Ty's meditations. That's the first one I've heard where he compares us to a leaf. But it's so right on to what I wanted to talk about this morning, because it's like it's not only do we share the qualities of the leaf and the Buddha and all beings, but we share the nature of a leaf and a Buddha and all beings together. So, one way of looking at this is that we realize that since we share all these things with all beings, nothing really comes from the outside, that our being together pervades everywhere throughout space and time, as we'll say in some Buddhist meditations. And, for anything to appear or to appear to exist, our awareness has to be there first. Nothing appears without our awareness of it. So, often in terms of the first steps of self inquiry are to notice thinking, how they arise and fall away, or dissolve back into awareness, and notice our seeing, our hearing, and our feeling, how that they all four follow the same process of arising and then dissolving back in. So that's what we call impermanence. And so to really, to talk about it, we have to use dualistic terms. So it's always frustrating to try to talk about it in one way. But to turn our attention, to allow our focus to relax and soften, and to contemplate what Ty is talking about in his meditations. The separate self that we think we are, when we realize it's like a leaf, it's totally at the whim of nature. It's totally at the whim of the wind and the earth and the sky, and it's floating around. And if a leaf thinks it's in control, it's not going to have a very happy life, is it? It's going to suffer quite a bit if it's going to try to preserve itself. It's just going to float, and it has a much easier time floating to the ground if it just relaxes, lets attention fall back onto the source, which in itself, is not perceivable or describable, but is more intimate than anything else in our life. It's more intimate because it's so close, closer than close, we'll say. So as the infinite awareness becomes more intimate, and we realize that it's actually closer than close because it is us, our self becomes smaller than small, like a leaf in comparison. In fact, smaller than small means we can't find it at all, and it's for all practical purposes. In our actual experience, it's not there. It has no control, it has no effect over the wind or nature or the cosmos. So, but that's a big clue to our self, the big self with an S, big S, is that nothing comes from outside, and that can be a great release of fear. Because we know that everything comes from our being. Whatever we experience, the worst horrors, they're not separate from our very being here and now. And, just to contemplate this, you could say it's like thinking outside the box, right? It maybe starts off with thinking outside the box, but then the transformative power of mindfulness, unconditional acceptance, and compassion, that transforms into being outside the box. The box here means the container of self that we think we are, right? So being outside the box is basically the same as realizing there is no box, there is no container. It's just, we're just out here floating in space. And that's scary to the part of us that feels like we need to stay in control. But when we realize we're the leaf, it's much easier that way, you know. We can have compassion for the leaf, but realizing we are the leaf, and then realizing how, you know, Buddha's compassion takes care of the leaf, it takes care of us in the same way. There is a presence here in the here and now that has this unconditional acceptance and vast openness, which is the same as vast freedom. So it actually has the freedom to take the form of a human being, and that's what we are. We're this vast freedom taking the form of a human being. So Thay makes this so clear in so many different ways, you know, because he has that personal touch. He's totally free to be a person, to totally embody being a person. And we have that freedom too. We just need to learn how to practice, which is receiving the deeper, you know, looking deeply, is receiving that unconditional acceptance, that unconditional openness and freedom, so that we can really embody it totally and have the freedom to live this life in the spirit of equanimity. And that's receiving Buddha's equanimity, which is unconditional also. So, you know, an intellectual understanding of this isn't enough, but if we begin by loosening our belief structures about things, then we can open up and have the courage to face the deeper feelings of fear, you know, locked inside our bodies, or that appear to be locked inside our bodies. We need to first be able to really question ourselves. Do we really exist as a separate human being? Is that who we really are? Is there really an outside world separate from us? And, you know, science tells us that we are just one energy now. You know, Einstein, he didn't discover the theory of relativity with his rational mind. And in quantum physics, you know, when you get into nanotechnology smaller than the atoms, all the dualistic presuppositions about reality are out the window. There's no space, there's no time, there's no separation there. So that becomes our experience if we surrender to that spirit of science that Einstein did. I mean, obviously he had a super brain, but his spirit of inquiry was very, very deep. And so science is on our side on this. It's not an enemy. And our thinking is not an enemy. It's not anything we have to be afraid of or do anything about. But this spirit of oneness, the spirit of realizing and surrendering to the higher power that Thay so wonderfully describes and embodies, it's really in harmony with what we mentioned. I think I mentioned at the end of last week that Ramana Maharshi said that surrender itself is a mighty prayer. And he also said that being unattached to our thoughts is the greatest devotion. So that's another, being unattached to thinking in our contemplation is that deepest surrender. And it is that deepest receiving of the spirit of the Buddhas. So one of the last thing I wanted to just say a little bit about the topic of resistance, because a friend of mine called me last night, who is actually, he was the bureau chief of the Associated Press in Asia. He knows a lot of people in Eastern Europe and stuff. And so I was going to after we're done, I'll send out an email where we can send money for humanitarian aid in Ukraine. And he called me last night because he got depressed thinking about there was 1,300 people, and most of them were kids, in this shelter that was bombed. I think it was it was a building that underground had a bomb shelter, and they're trying to figure out how many people actually survived it. But he called me because he was so depressed about that. He said, what can you do to help me with my depression about that, you know? And what came up to me is that, well, um, the spirit of being open, receiving the openness and unconditional acceptance of the higher power, although I didn't really explain it in those terms, but for us, I can explain it in those terms. It opens up the freedom to fully be human and to fully feel that pain, as much as we can, to feel that pain of the suffering of people in Ukraine, but also the freedom not to resist it. We'll have experiences, like I had an experience where I had this really painful eye, and I had to, after an eye operation, I had to have this eye patch for like 9 hours. And so the first half an hour, I was kind of resisting. This shouldn't be. The other eye was fine. It's this deep, painful throbbing, and I have to sit here for 9 hours. And then I realized, well, wait a minute, you're supposed to be a Zen guy. Let's look at this. Let's open up and receive the pain, just be the pain kind of thing. And, not quite, I wasn't being quite that harsh with myself, but it's like I was kind of, incorporating all the stuff I've been talking about and said, okay, you got to have to relive this stuff, So I just, once I removed and just opened up, I moved the energy into my heart, and that's what I always do when I feel afraid. And the 9 hours was fine. I mean, it hurt more, but it bothered me so much less to just surrender to the process. So, yeah, so I'll send this email out after we're done, and hopefully you'll be able to send some money too, since I think that I feel a lot better after I did that. I send them quite a bit of money, so.